She lost her husband, her home, and everything she owned in a single day. At 67, Martha stood alone, holding nothing but the keys to a collapsing shack no one wanted. "This is your share," they told her. A broken house in the middle of nowhere. But what they didn't know was that hidden beneath that rotten floor was something that would leave an entire town speechless. Life doesn't always fall apart slowly. Sometimes it shatters in a single moment so quietly that you don't even realize what has been taken from you until you're already standing in the silence it leaves behind. One day you're surrounded by routines that feel permanent, morning tea in the same cup, familiar footsteps in the hallway, a voice calling your name from another room, and the next day all of it is gone as if it never belonged to you in the first place. That's the kind of change no one prepares you for, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There are no alarms, no warning signs, no clear signal that your life is about to split into before and after. It just happens, and suddenly you're expected to accept it like it's normal. For someone like Martha, life had been built on decades of quiet consistency, 40 years of shared meals, shared struggles, shared dreams. She had spent most of her adult life believing that stability was something you could build brick by brick, something that would stand strong as long as you kept showing up, kept giving, kept loving. And for a long time it seemed true. The house they lived in wasn't just a structure, it was a collection of memories layered into every corner. The walls had witnessed laughter, arguments, celebrations, and countless ordinary days that felt too small to matter at the time, but now meant everything. But life has a way of reminding you that nothing is ever truly guaranteed. Not relationships, not security, not even the sense of identity you've spent years shaping. When the divorce happened, it didn't feel like a gradual ending. It felt like someone had pulled the ground out from beneath her without warning. One decision, one legal process, one final conversation, and everything she thought was permanent was suddenly temporary. The same people who once spoke about forever were now dividing possessions, calculating worth, and reducing decades of life into percentages and paperwork. What makes moments like that so painful isn't just the loss itself, but how quickly everything changes. There's no time to adjust emotionally because reality moves faster than your ability to process it. One minute you're part of a shared life, and the next you're alone, trying to understand how something so solid could disappear so completely. The shock doesn't come from the event alone. It comes from the realization that all the things you trusted to stay are capable of leaving. And it's not just the big things that hurt. It's the small details that follow you. The empty chair across the table, the silence where there used to be conversation, the absence of someone who once filled the space without effort. Those are the moments that quietly remind you that your life has changed, even when everything around you looks the same. It's in those moments that you begin to understand how deeply your identity was tied to what you've lost. When life changes in seconds, it forces you into a position where you have no choice but to face yourself. There's no familiar structure to lean on, no routine to hide inside. You're left with questions that don't have easy answers. Who are you without the roles you've been playing for years? What do you do when the path you've been following suddenly disappears? How do you rebuild something when you're not even sure where to begin? For many people, the fear isn't just about losing what they have. It's about not knowing how to start again. Starting over sounds simple in theory, but in reality, it's one of the hardest things a person can do. It requires letting go of what was, even when it still feels real in your heart. It requires stepping into uncertainty without any guarantee that things will get better. And perhaps most difficult of all, it requires believing that your life still has value, even when everything familiar has been stripped away. What makes this kind of change even more intense is how isolating it can feel. People around you might offer sympathy, advice, or encouragement, but no one can fully understand what it feels like to lose your entire world in a single moment. From the outside, it might look like just another life event, but from the inside, it feels like a complete reset, a forced beginning that you never asked for. And while others move on with their lives, you're still standing in the aftermath, trying to piece together what's left. But hidden within that sudden change is something most people don't notice right away. When everything is taken from you, you're also being given something, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. You're being given a blank space, a chance to see life differently, a moment to rediscover parts of yourself that may have been buried under years of routine and responsibility. It's not a gift that feels good when it arrives. In fact, it often feels like loss, confusion, and pain. But over time, it can become something else entirely. Because when life changes in seconds, it reveals truths that are easy to ignore when everything is stable. It shows you how strong you really are, even when you feel weak. It teaches you what actually matters, not in theory but in reality. And it forces you to confront the difference between what you thought you needed and what you truly need to move forward. Martha didn't plan to start over at 67. No one imagines rebuilding their life at that stage. But life doesn't follow plans. It doesn't ask for permission before it changes direction. And sometimes, the moments that feel like endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Not the kind that come with excitement or clarity, but the kind that begin quietly, in uncertainty, with nothing but the smallest spark of resilience to guide you forward. Because when everything changes in an instant, what remains isn't the life you had, but the strength you didn't know you possessed. There's a moment in life that feels like falling but without the impact. A moment where everything slows down just enough for you to realize how far you've dropped, yet nothing around you reaches out to catch you. That's what rock bottom feels like. It's not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, still, and painfully ordinary. It's standing in a place you never imagined you would be, holding the remains of a life that once felt secure, and realizing there's nowhere lower left to go. For Martha, that moment didn't come with a storm or a crowd. It came with a set of keys and a view she couldn't recognize as her own future. The shack stood there like a forgotten memory, leaning under the weight of time, its broken edges reflecting exactly how she felt inside. This wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of everything she had lost, everything she had been reduced to, everything that no longer existed in her life. And in that moment, it was easy to believe that this was the end of her story. Rock bottom has a way of convincing you that nothing good can come from it. It whispers that this is where things stop, where hope fades, where effort no longer matters. It tells you that you've already lost too much, that there's no reason to try anymore. And when you're standing there, surrounded by the evidence of your losses, it's hard not to believe it. It's hard not to let that voice settle into your thoughts and shape the way you see the world. But what makes rock bottom so powerful isn't just the pain, it's the perspective it forces on you. When you have everything, it's easy to take life for granted. You move through your days without questioning the stability around you. You assume that what you have will always be there, that the ground beneath your feet is solid and unchanging. But when you hit the lowest point, that illusion disappears. You begin to see things clearly, not as they were, but as they truly are. In that broken shack, Martha wasn't just facing her situation, she was facing herself. There were no distractions, no familiar comforts to hide behind, just silence, emptiness, and the weight of everything she had been through. It's in those moments that people often feel the most vulnerable, but also the most real. Because when everything else is gone, the only thing left is the truth. And the truth is, rock bottom isn't just a place of loss. It's also a place of possibility. Not because it feels hopeful, but because it leaves room for something new to exist. When you've lost everything, there's nothing left to lose. And strangely, that can become a kind of freedom. A painful, uncomfortable freedom, but freedom nonetheless. You're no longer tied to expectations, routines, or versions of yourself that no longer fit. You're standing in a space where anything, no matter how small, can become a step forward. The challenge is that this shift in perspective doesn't happen instantly. At first, rock bottom feels heavy. Every thought is weighed down by regret, by what-ifs, by memories that refuse to let go. You replay moments in your mind, wondering where things went wrong, wishing you could go back and change something. But slowly, almost without noticing, those thoughts begin to change. The questions shift from "why did this happen?" to "what do I do now?" And that shift, as small as it seems, is the beginning of something important. Because the moment you start asking what comes next, you're no longer stuck. You're no longer defined only by what you've lost. You're starting to think about what's possible, even if that possibility feels distant or uncertain. It doesn't mean the pain disappears. It doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes easier. But it means you're beginning to move, even if it's just in your mind. For someone like Martha, that movement started with small actions. Looking around the shack, noticing what could be fixed, what could be cleaned, what could be changed. At first, those actions might seem insignificant. Sweeping dust, opening a window, letting light in. These are not dramatic transformations. But they matter, because they represent effort. They represent a decision to engage with the present instead of being trapped in the past. And that's one of the most important truths about rock bottom. It doesn't require you to rebuild everything at once. It doesn't expect you to have a perfect plan or a clear direction. All it asks is that you take one step, just one, and then another. And over time, those small steps begin to add up in ways you didn't expect. There's also something deeply human about finding strength in places that once felt unbearable. The same shack that looked like a symbol of defeat slowly becomes something else. Not because it changes overnight, but because your relationship with it changes. What once felt like a prison starts to feel like a starting point. What once felt like an ending begins to feel like a beginning, even if you're not ready to fully accept it yet. This is where resilience quietly takes shape, not as a grand, visible force, but as a series of choices made in difficult moments. Choosing to get up even when it feels pointless. Choosing to care even when you're tired. Choosing to try even when you're unsure. These choices don't always feel strong in the moment. In fact, they often feel small, almost insignificant. But over time, they build something powerful. And perhaps the most surprising part of hitting rock bottom is realizing that it doesn't define you in the way you feared it would. It doesn't erase your worth, your identity, or your ability to create something meaningful. If anything, it strips away everything that isn't essential, leaving behind a clearer version of who you are. A version that isn't based on what you had, but on what you can become. For Martha, the shack didn't magically turn into something beautiful overnight. The journey wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments where the weight of everything felt too much. But those moments didn't stop her from continuing. And that's what made the difference. Not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to keep going despite it. Rock bottom has a reputation for being the end, but in reality, it's often the point where real change begins. Not the kind of change that's easy or comfortable, but the kind that reshapes your understanding of life, of yourself, of what truly matters. It forces you to let go of illusions and face reality, but in doing so, it also opens the door to something new. Because when you've seen how low things can go, you start to recognize even the smallest improvements as meaningful. A little progress feels bigger. A small victory feels significant. And slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin to build something again. Not the same life you had before, but something different. Something that carries the lessons of what you've been through. And maybe that's the hidden truth behind rock bottom. It doesn't exist to break you completely. It exists to show you that even when everything falls apart, there's still something within you that can rise, something that refuses to stay down, something that begins to move forward even in the quietest, most uncertain moments. There are moments in life that seem too small to matter. A sound you almost ignore, a feeling you almost dismiss, a thought that passes through your mind so quickly you barely notice it. Most of the time, these moments slip by without consequence, blending into the background of everyday life. But sometimes, one of those small moments holds the power to change everything, if only you choose to pay attention. Curiosity often begins as something quiet. It doesn't demand attention or force action. It simply lingers, gently asking questions that don't have immediate answers. What was that sound? Why does this feel different? What happens if I look a little closer? These questions are easy to ignore, especially when you're tired, overwhelmed, or convinced that nothing good can come from your situation. And yet, they are often the very questions that lead to something unexpected. For Martha, curiosity didn't arrive as excitement. It came as hesitation, a faint sound beneath the floor, barely noticeable, easily dismissed as the natural creaking of an old, broken house. In another moment, in another state of mind, she might have ignored it completely. After everything she had been through, it would have been understandable to simply accept the silence and avoid anything that might bring more uncertainty into her life. But something about that sound stayed with her. Not loud enough to demand action, but persistent enough to be remembered. It's interesting how the mind works in moments like these. Even when you try to move on, a small detail can pull you back, quietly asking for your attention. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't promise anything. It just exists, waiting for you to decide whether it matters. And that decision, as simple as it seems, can become a turning point. Curiosity requires a kind of courage that often goes unnoticed. It's not the dramatic bravery we usually think about. It's the quiet willingness to explore something unknown, even when you're unsure of what you'll find. It means stepping beyond what is familiar, even if what is familiar is uncomfortable or disappointing. In Martha's case, the familiar was a life that had already fallen apart. The unknown, however uncertain, held the possibility of something different. What makes curiosity so powerful is that it opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. It invites discovery not by force but by choice. When you act on curiosity, you're essentially saying that you're willing to engage with the world, even if you don't fully understand it. You're allowing yourself to believe, even if only slightly, that there might be something worth finding. At first, Martha's actions were simple. She didn't expect anything significant, tapping the floor, noticing the hollow sound, pausing to think about it. These are not actions that feel life-changing in the moment. They are small, almost ordinary responses to a minor curiosity. But what makes them important is not their size, it's their direction. Each step moved her closer to something she didn't yet know existed. There's a tendency to underestimate these kinds of actions because they don't feel dramatic. We often imagine life-changing moments as big, obvious events, decisions that come with clarity and certainty. But in reality, many of the most important changes begin with something much smaller. A question, a pause, a moment of attention that leads to another, and then another. Curiosity creates a path where there was none before. It doesn't reveal the entire journey at once. Instead, it offers just enough to take the next step. And that's what makes it both powerful and challenging. You have to move forward without knowing where it will lead. You have to trust that the act of exploring is valuable, even if the outcome is uncertain. For someone in Martha's position, that uncertainty could have been enough to stop her. After everything she had lost, the idea of facing more unknowns might have felt overwhelming. It's natural to want stability, to avoid anything that might bring more change or discomfort. But curiosity doesn't always align with comfort. In fact, it often pulls you away from it, guiding you toward places that feel unfamiliar and unpredictable. And yet, it's in those unfamiliar places that new possibilities begin to emerge. When Martha decided to investigate the sound, she wasn't just reacting to a noise. She was choosing to engage with her environment in a way that went beyond passive acceptance. She was saying, in her own quiet way, that she was still willing to look, to question, to discover. This willingness is what separates stagnation from movement. Without curiosity, it's easy to remain stuck, to accept things as they are without ever considering that they could be different. Curiosity disrupts that stillness. It introduces motion, even if it's slow and uncertain. And once that motion begins, it becomes harder to return to complete inaction. There's also something deeply empowering about discovering something on your own. When curiosity leads you to an unexpected outcome, it changes the way you see yourself. You realize that you are capable of uncovering things, of finding meaning, of creating change through your own actions. This realization doesn't come from external validation or guidance. It comes from your own experience, your own decision to explore. In Martha's case, what she found beneath the floor was far beyond what she could have imagined. But the significance of that discovery wasn't just in what she found. It was in the fact that she found it at all. If she had ignored that initial moment of curiosity, if she had dismissed the sound as unimportant, none of it would have happened. The opportunity would have remained hidden, not because it didn't exist, but because it was never sought. This is what makes curiosity so closely tied to destiny. It doesn't guarantee a specific outcome, but it creates the conditions for something to happen. It turns possibility into action. It transforms the unknown from something distant into something reachable. And in doing so, it shapes the direction of your life in ways that are often impossible to predict. Of course, not every moment of curiosity leads to a dramatic discovery. Many times it leads to nothing significant at all. But that doesn't make it any less important, because the value of curiosity isn't only in the outcome, it's in the process. It's in the habit of paying attention, of asking questions, of being open to what might be there. Over time, this habit builds a mindset that is more engaged, more aware, more willing to explore. And when the right moment does come, when there is something meaningful to be found, that mindset makes all the difference. It allows you to recognize the opportunity instead of overlooking it. It gives you the courage to act instead of hesitating. It turns a small, easily ignored moment into something transformative. For Martha, that transformation didn't begin with the discovery itself. It began with the decision to look. A simple choice made in a quiet moment without any guarantee of what would follow. And yet, that choice set everything in motion. It connected her to something hidden, something unexpected, something that would eventually change the course of her life. It's easy to think of destiny as something predetermined, something that happens to you regardless of your actions. But moments like this suggest something different. They suggest that destiny is, at least in part, shaped by the choices you make, especially the small ones. The ones that don't feel important at the time, but carry the potential to lead somewhere new. Because sometimes, the difference between an ordinary life and an extraordinary turn of events isn't a grand decision or a dramatic change. Sometimes, it's simply the willingness to pause, to listen, and to follow a question that refuses to be ignored, even when it begins as nothing more than a faint, almost forgettable sound beneath your feet. There are moments in life when no one is watching, no one is judging, and no one would ever know what choice you make. Those are the moments that reveal who you really are. Not the version of you that exists in front of others, shaped by expectations and opinions, but the quieter, more honest version that only appears when you are alone with your thoughts. It's easy to do the right thing when there's recognition attached to it, when there's a reward, or when someone is there to hold you accountable. But when all of that disappears, when the decision becomes entirely yours, that's when character shows itself in its purest form. For Martha, this moment didn't come with pressure from the outside. There was no crowd, no consequences she could see, no voice telling her what to do. It was just her, sitting in a quiet room, surrounded by something she never expected to find. The money, the jewelry, the letters, all of it lay in front of her like a question waiting to be answered. It wasn't just about what she had discovered. It was about what she would do with it. After everything she had been through, no one would have blamed her for keeping it. In fact, many would have encouraged it. She had lost her home, her stability, the life she had spent decades building. This discovery could have been seen as compensation, as a second chance, as something she deserved after so much loss. From a certain perspective, taking it would have made perfect sense. It would have solved her problems, given her comfort, and provided security in a way she no longer had. And that's what makes the situation so powerful, because the choice wasn't between right and wrong in an obvious way. It was between what was easy and what was honest, between what could benefit her immediately and what aligned with a deeper sense of integrity. These are the kinds of choices that don't come with clear instructions. They require you to look inward, to listen to something quieter than logic or convenience. Character is often misunderstood as something fixed, something you either have or you don't. But in reality, it's something that is built and revealed through decisions like this. It's shaped in moments where there is no external pressure, no immediate consequence, no clear reward. It's formed in the space between thought and action, where you decide not just what you can do, but what you should do. For Martha, the temptation was real. The idea of keeping the money wasn't something she could simply dismiss without thought. It lingered, as it would for anyone in her position. She imagined what it could change, how it could improve her life, how it could erase the uncertainty she was now facing. These thoughts weren't wrong, they were human. They reflected a natural desire for security, for comfort, for relief from hardship. But alongside those thoughts there was something else, a quiet awareness that this wasn't hers, that someone at some point had hidden it with a purpose, with a reason that went beyond her own situation. And even though that person was no longer there, even though there was no one to enforce that truth, it still mattered. Not because of rules or laws, but because of something internal, something that couldn't be ignored once it was recognized. This is where true character begins to take shape, not in the absence of temptation, but in the presence of it. It's easy to assume that strong people don't struggle with these decisions, that they simply know what to do without hesitation. But that's rarely the case. Strength often comes from facing the same doubts, the same desires, the same internal conflicts as anyone else, and choosing differently despite them. What Martha chose wasn't the easiest path. It didn't offer immediate comfort or reward. In fact, it required more effort, more uncertainty, more patience. She had to search for answers, to find out who the rightful owner might be, to take steps that didn't guarantee any personal benefit. From the outside, it might have seemed like she was giving something up, but from the inside, it was something else entirely. Because when you choose honesty in a moment where dishonesty would go unnoticed, you're not just making a decision about the situation. You're making a decision about yourself. You're defining the kind of person you want to be, not in theory, but in action. And that definition becomes something you carry with you, something that shapes how you see yourself and how you move through the world. There's a kind of peace that comes from this, one that doesn't depend on external circumstances. It's not loud or obvious. It doesn't come with applause or recognition, but it's steady. It's the quiet confidence of knowing that your actions align with your values, even when no one else is there to see them. And that kind of peace is difficult to replace with anything else. It's also important to recognize that these moments don't define you because of their scale, but because of their sincerity. From the outside, Martha's choice might seem significant because of the amount of money involved. But the true weight of the decision lies in the intention behind it. It's about choosing integrity over convenience, truth over advantage, even when the difference isn't visible to anyone else. In a world where so much attention is placed on outcomes, on success, on what people gain, it's easy to overlook the importance of how those outcomes are achieved. But character isn't built on what you have. It's built on how you choose to act, especially when those choices are difficult or uncomfortable. It's reflected in the decisions that don't make headlines, the ones that happen quietly, without recognition. Martha's situation highlights something that applies to everyone, regardless of circumstance. At some point, everyone faces a moment where they have to choose between what is easy and what is right. These moments may not always involve something as tangible as money or property. Sometimes they appear in smaller, less obvious ways. A decision to be honest when it's inconvenient, to take responsibility when it's easier to avoid it, to act with kindness when there's no expectation to do so. And in each of these moments, the same principle applies. The choice you make doesn't just affect the situation, it affects you. It shapes your sense of self, your understanding of your own values, your ability to trust yourself in the future. Because once you've made a decision, you carry it with you, whether consciously or not. For Martha, choosing honesty wasn't just about returning what wasn't hers. It was about holding onto something that couldn't be taken away from her, no matter what she had lost. It was about proving to herself that even in a moment of vulnerability, even after everything had been stripped away, she still had control over who she was and how she chose to act. And that's what makes character so powerful. It's not dependent on circumstances, on wealth, or on external validation. It exists in the choices you make when none of those things are present. It shows itself in the quiet moments, the unseen decisions, the paths you take when no one is guiding you. Because in the end, it's not the world that defines your character. It's not the recognition, the rewards, or the outcomes. It's the choices you make when you're alone, when there's nothing to gain and nothing to lose except your own sense of what is right, and the understanding that who you are is not determined by what you find, but by what you choose to do with it. People spend most of their lives chasing the idea of being rich. Not just financially, but in a way that promises comfort, security, and a sense of control over the future. Money becomes the symbol of that dream, something that seems to solve problems before they even appear. It offers choices, stability, and the illusion that life can be managed if you just have enough of it. And for a long time, it's easy to believe that this is what real wealth looks like. For someone like Martha, that belief had been part of her life for decades. A stable home, shared responsibilities, a predictable routine. These were the things that made her feel secure. They weren't extravagant, but they were enough to create a sense of balance. And when that balance was suddenly taken away, it didn't just feel like a financial loss. It felt like losing everything that defined her version of a good life. When she found the hidden fortune beneath the shack, it seemed like the universe was correcting a mistake, as if everything she had lost was being returned to her in a different form. In that moment, the idea of wealth became very real again. This wasn't just a concept or a distant dream. It was something she could hold, something that could immediately change her circumstances. It could give her comfort, restore her security, and allow her to rebuild her life in a way that felt familiar. But what makes this moment so important is not just the opportunity it presented, but the way it challenged everything she thought she understood about value. Because for the first time, she had to ask herself a question that went deeper than need or desire. She had to ask what kind of life she actually wanted moving forward, and what kind of person she wanted to be within it. It's easy to assume that wealth is about accumulation, that the more you have, the better your life becomes. But this perspective often overlooks something important. The emotional weight of what you carry matters just as much as the material value of what you possess. If what you have comes at the cost of your peace, your integrity, or your sense of self, then it doesn't truly enrich your life. It complicates it in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. For Martha, keeping the money would have changed her circumstances, but it would not have changed the truth behind it. She would always know that it wasn't hers, that it belonged to someone else's story, someone else's intention. And that awareness, no matter how quiet, would stay with her. It would exist in the background of every decision she made, every comfort she experienced, every moment of relief it provided. There's a difference between having something and feeling right about having it. That difference is where emotional wealth begins to take shape. It's not about what you own, but about how your choices align with your values. When those two things are in harmony, there's a sense of clarity that no amount of money can replicate. A kind of inner stability that doesn't depend on external conditions. This is what Martha began to understand as she sat with her discovery. The money represented a solution, but not necessarily the right one. It could fix immediate problems, but it couldn't give her something she had already started to rediscover in a different way. Her sense of honesty, her sense of purpose, her connection to what truly mattered. Real wealth often reveals itself in unexpected ways. It doesn't always look like abundance in the traditional sense. Sometimes it looks like the ability to make a difficult choice without regret. Sometimes it looks like peace in the middle of uncertainty. Sometimes it looks like the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you acted in a way that reflects who you truly are. When Martha chose to return the fortune, she wasn't rejecting the idea of wealth. She was redefining it. She was choosing a form of richness that couldn't be measured in numbers but could be felt in a much deeper way. She was choosing clarity over confusion, peace over conflict, meaning over convenience. And what's remarkable is that this choice didn't leave her empty. In fact, it did the opposite. It filled her life with something more sustainable than money could offer, a sense of dignity that came from doing what was right, a sense of connection that came from helping someone else, a sense of fulfillment that didn't rely on possession but on intention. The world often teaches people to hold on tightly to whatever they gain, to protect it, to build more from it, to measure success by how much they accumulate. But there's another way to look at it. Sometimes, what you give away defines your life more than what you keep, not because loss is valuable in itself, but because the act of giving can reveal what you truly value. In Martha's case, giving away the fortune didn't reduce her life, it transformed it. It shifted her focus from survival to meaning. It allowed her to step into a version of herself that wasn't defined by what she had lost, but by what she was capable of choosing. And that shift changed everything. There's also something deeply freeing about letting go of what doesn't belong to you. It removes a kind of invisible weight, one that might not be obvious at first but becomes clearer over time. When you no longer have to justify, defend, or question what you have, you're left with something simpler and more honest. A life that feels aligned, even if it's not perfect. This doesn't mean that material wealth has no value. It can provide comfort, opportunities, and security. But it's not the only form of wealth, and it's not always the most important one. Emotional wealth, the kind that comes from integrity, purpose, and connection, often has a more lasting impact. It shapes how you experience your life, how you relate to others, and how you see yourself. Martha's journey shows that richness is not a fixed state, but a perspective. It's not determined by what you start with or what you lose along the way. It's shaped by the choices you make, especially in moments where you have the power to choose differently. It's found in the balance between what you need and what you believe is right. And perhaps the most powerful part of her story is that her sense of wealth didn't come from gaining something new, but from understanding something she already had. The ability to choose, the ability to act with intention, the ability to create meaning in a situation that could have easily felt empty. By the end of her journey, Martha didn't see herself as someone who had been left with nothing. She saw herself as someone who had discovered something valuable within herself. Something that couldn't be taken away by circumstances, by loss, or by time. A quiet strength, a clear sense of right and wrong, and a deep understanding of what truly matters. Moral, real wealth is not measured by what you own, but by the peace you feel, the choices you make, and the goodness you bring into the lives of others. This story is created for entertainment and inspirational purposes. While it reflects real-life emotions and situations, the characters, events, and details are fictional and may not represent actual people or incidents. The message is meant to inspire positive thinking, honesty, and resilience in difficult times.